Psychics are used by police departments, right? There are police departments even in this country overseas, because what they're accessing, and this is where it gets very nonlinear, although I'm using linear language to describe it, it's part of the challenge. You're accessing sort of the intentionality space of a human being, whether it's past or future, meaning you go back in time to see, can you then see evidence, right, that may reveal additional, right? And many of it for psychics, it's the proximity, right? There are other ways, remote, okay? This is the so-called remote viewing, which is something even the U.S. intelligence agencies have pursued in the past that has become more public in more recent years. Again, a very nonlinear space.
Welcome back. I'm here again with Thomas Drake. Tom, it's great to see you again.
Yes, again. Thank you.
All right. I want to warn people because the last two episodes may be the first time that they've come to my channel. And where we're about to go, if that was a very linear, very grounded story in geopolitics and national security, you're about to get a very nonlinear, I wouldn't say speculative, but something that kind of pushes against or pushes out to the farthest reaches of quantum mechanics, theories of reality, plus some geopolitics maybe thrown in. So, in the last episode, we talked about your trial, the 10 charges, but that wasn't the first time you heard about these 10 charges. When was the first time you heard about these 10 charges?
Well, that's a whole nother set of history. It's in part hard to explain fully, and it's quite nonlinear, but it's probably important to first, in a more linear fashion initially, to at least provide the series of events that led me to meeting a precognitive psychic named Chris Robinson. So I'm at NSA. This is not long after 9/11. And as I mentioned, I got to know a number of the skunkworks efforts, projects at NSA, including one particular effort that was way out of the box in terms of ways in which you could analyze data in a number of different ways, not using even traditional methods, which tend to be quite fixed. These are methods that was willing to consider other indicators, to use that word, indicators, that may say something meaningful about human culture, the human condition, and other ways in which to sort of uncover behaviors between people, including the uncovering networks of communications in ways that weren't part of sort of the institutionalized mechanisms that have been in place for quite a while. So this is going well beyond sort of the habits of intelligence collection and analysis, and even to the point where these techniques would not be accepted sort of by what they call the production chain at NSA. We're talking use of language, right? Specialized language, jargon to describe in shorthand. Because production chain, what does that mean? Yeah, well, chain, production chain, right? You have different kinds of chains, right? Well, this is the way in which data is ingested based on source method, sent back through various channels, collected, right? And then analyzed. It can be raw analysis, but then you could have more, although technically NSA was never an agency that created finished intelligence, but you would at least, instead of just sending it out raw, which actually became quite controversial after 9/11, it's like how far up the is, if say, the stream do you go to, how far close do you get to the source, the spring of the data?
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
How far up you go, because obviously it's the pure in terms of not losing anything. It's necessary to get closer to the source. So if you're downstream, then you can have other tributaries and you get contamination. And if you're trying to figure out the source once it gets to the ocean, that's going to be extremely difficult because it's quite diluted. It may still be water, yes, but you don't really have any sense of how did it get there, right? You can even track, but unless you were following, that's part of it. It's like, how do you account for the information itself? But information by itself doesn't mean anything, right? Intelligence really is kind of, there's sort of intelligence. There had this whole cycle, right? And the cycle also included the raw source sensor level all the way to wisdom, if you want to talk about sort of the pyramid, as it were. And intelligence, in essence, is saying, I'm providing some, not just the contextual meaning for it, but I'm actually providing my analytic. And that's where you get into like confidence levels and credibility and all this other thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and confidence levels is actually a huge thing in the intelligence community because you can have low confidence, which means, yeah, there might be evidence or indicators to say this is that or could indicate, but you don't have enough information, right, to say with a higher level of confidence that it's closer to the truth. But or you may be asked to look at something, but you just don't have enough source information, whether it's single, which is normal, which you never rely on a single source. You just don't have enough, right? Well, this one organization, which again, with a skunkworks operation, it was in the research space, right? So NSA actually has a whole nother part of itself where it does advanced research. And in advanced research, you had all kinds of flexibility, freedom of movement in terms of avenues to pursue. And one of these was just, you know what, let's just kind of invert the entire cycle, turn it inside out and just say, is there another way? Or there's different ways in which we can not just look at information created by humans and their systems, but other ways to assemble it. Is there another way to look at it? And this gets into would be a much larger conversation about how do you array information in different ways to make meaning of it. And one way is, because this is the historical nature of NSA, I have to forget 7-bit, right? 7-bit characters, right? Where you're limited by the fact that you can only represent information in a 7-bit form, right? This is in terms of computers. You're in the digital age, right? Is there another way of looking at it? Can you look at it, in terms of link analysis? Can you look, which is one way to do it? Can you look at it in terms of social networks? Can you look at it in terms of dimensionally, not just two-dimensional, but also in the form of like pictures or graphs? And then what's critical, that's one thing, but how do you show that, like display it, right? Numbers by themselves don't mean anything. Assigning weights don't mean anything, right? None of that. So this organization was really focused on, especially in an environment where you have such disparate avenues for information, backgrounds, cultural factors, all of these things. Some of these are less than linear, meaning you're getting into like human intentionality.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, Email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
People are planning, right? Well, what are the indicators that would show, even from traditional sources, that something is afoot, something is ongoing, and then there's like different stages of that. And we're talking right up and until sort of the no-go or go signal is given. Now, this became particularly important because of the failure of 9/11 to keep people out of harm's way, that it begged the question, could we have known sooner? Okay. And this is beyond even some of the traditional methods that had broken down.
Mm-hmm.
So this organization had an even greater sense of urgency after 9/11 to go back and see if there was because this is like, hey, here's our databases. Is there another way, or are there additional things that we can find and display to provide greater understanding as to what we're looking at? And then from that, can we provide warnings or simply advanced analytic, both near term, midterm, and even long range analysis? So this is part of this organization at NSA. It was a research lab, pure and simple, very small number, very agile, very adroit. They had IT specialists, they had cultural anthropology, they had different types of technologists, they had traditional linguistic analysis, data, they had data computation, display experts as well, and being able to, and then you could play scenarios. And because you're inside the fence, so we used to say, you obviously had carte blanche access to a lot of things that were already collected.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also like future scanning, meaning what is emerging that would allow you to anticipate the future.
Kind of like the Office of Net Assessment was in the Pentagon.
Yeah. Now, I was involved in a lot of what I call more traditional tabletop scenarios of various types.
Right.
And you're always running what ifs, right? Based on this, based on that, this happens, right? But, they're tabletop. Some could get rather involved. Then you had I would call more real world, like some we mentioned in the previous segments, military exercises where you're actually using real hardware, real people, real platforms. Even when I was in electronic warfare, we could actually go as close to, it's short of flipping the button on that would actually turn on the jammer. Well, there was a special mode where you would still turn on, but the jamming would actually go into basically a big bucket that was filled with oil, to dissipate it. It didn't actually radiate outside the airplane. So, but here you're in the human space. I mean, remember, this is like you're depending on. It's like this is the extraordinary complexity and variety of people across multiple backgrounds and heritages and cultures and different nation states and languages and all of this. Very, very robust environment and extraordinarily complex and very dynamic and not getting any simpler. So 9/11 became this catalyst. I'll use that word, catalyst, to do this type of research. That research also extended to completely non-traditional. So again, I have to sort of compress this because I became aware of one way of looking at the future, near term in particular, near term, right? Or this is interesting, basically past future, meaning you actually go back into the past based on artifacts. Can you then interpret what could happen based on what you had or was available to you from that past, right? So one of them is, and this has been psychics. I'm going to say this is a cautionary note here because psychics, this is very loaded. I'll say there's a lot of clowns, frauds, fakery,
a lot of noise.
Here. A lot of noise. So this what I signal to noise ratio is extraordinarily high, right? How do you sort of separate?
noise to signal ratio is extraordinarily high.
Well, the noise is higher. That's why I would say signal.
Right.
I say signal and the noise.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
noise side is much higher, which means the signal is buried, right? This is something I had to learn about and even deal with in terms of just all the varieties of different types of signals that we would have to. You could, even though we had technology to help filter, right? But see, the filter itself can become an issue, right? So psychics have been used, are still used with all the controversy, right? And all the rabbit holes around them.
But to be clear, they're not the only, you're not going to make a strategic decision based on the testimony of one psychic. You're going to have all source intelligence. You're going to use mosaic theory. You're going to make sure that things triangulate. Right. I just want to make that
mosaic
clear.
is another term. It's actually is a term of art, even in intelligence, a mosaic, which is mean you bring in various, right? But it's a mosaic, and it can have different.
Also in investing, that's how I came to know it. It's brought in investing, which is why if the SEC ever investigates somebody, like an analyst, for correctly calling a stock, right? Generally, mosaic theory is the defense. So it's I didn't talk to anybody at the company. I just flew a helicopter over their facilities and saw that their inventory was building and made a call that they weren't selling, that they were going to miss their revenue in the next quarter. And I was right. And I triangulated all these pieces, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I didn't mean to take us off course.
It also works to expose fraud like Bernie Madoff, but that's how he went on for, many, many years. Mm-hmm. And particularly persistent analysts finally, although they kept, basically shutting him down for years. Yeah, that's an interesting story all by itself, because what are you looking for, right? They would indicate that, something's not quite right here, right? Speaking of mosaic theory. Psychics are used by police departments, right? There are police departments in this country overseas, because what they're accessing, and this is where it gets very nonlinear, although I'm using linear language to describe it, it's part of the challenge. You're accessing sort of the intentionality space of a human being, whether it's past or future, meaning you go back in time to see, can you then see evidence, right, that may reveal additional, right? And for psychics, it's the proximity, right? There are other ways, remote, okay? This is the so-called remote viewing, which is something even the U.S. intelligence agencies have pursued in the past that has become more public in more recent years. Again, a very nonlinear space. Because you're accessing something it's invisible. It doesn't lend itself to traditional mechanisms of scientific testing, classic scientific methods in terms of testing. It's based on, normal methods are based on five senses in terms of what I call the normal time-space continuum, to use a Star Trek phrase. So it doesn't lend itself to easy explanation at all. And yet, I'll just say the more reliable, again, it's not single source, you never, right, has helped police departments. I'm just using that as an example, right? So in my growing relationship, while I was a senior executive at NSA right after 9/11, I got to know through this organization, this research lab, that they were looking at the psychic space, right? What is it that allows a psychic, and remember, there's a whole set of categories, but the particular focus was existing. Can we glean additional information going back in time? Can we also project from the future based on what's emerging or could be emerging certain behaviors? And it's all based on intentionality. Now, this is where it gets very nonlinear, because how can you predict either backwards or forwards behavior, right? It's super dynamic. Well, in a more linear sense, people, we do plan. It's not like, you can say the only thing that matters is the now, and this gets into past, present, future, and leaving aside some of the present.
Simultaneity of time.
The only thing we actually know is the moments we live in, and then anything that's behind, well, Is it really behind, or what did it you see? So,
or it's happening. It's happening now. It's just at a lower frequency, and the future's happening now at a higher frequency, all simultaneously. That's a crude metaphor.
That's where the Interstellar movie is fascinating, because it really kind of addresses the time in itself, right? Is its own dimension in part.
Mm-hmm.
So, having said all that, right, that there might be something. And so this research lab was going off to explore that. In the process, and I was having a regular contact with them, because what their concern was, we missed a whole lot. And we missed it because if we had predicted this, separate from the decision mechanisms and the failures and breakdowns and siloing and all that, which are, it's the human behavior, but it's more at the institutional organizational level. Right? Could we have known better, known that we could have come to a better, basically a predictive outcome that we could then act on, right? To preclude, prevent, disrupt, even stop. And this gets into national command authorities, if you're talking U.S. national security, but also even at the local level, how do you preclude, right, these things from happening once you begin detecting them? Now, this, again, separate from what you do with it, right? You can find out later and react, or you can proact. But see, indications
this is like Minority Report, like Philip K. Dick kind of stuff, precogs
which is one of my favorite authors is Philip K. Dick. Yes,
almost precognitive.
Yes,
just by writing the thing.
Minority Report, and remember, it's interesting. It was always the Minority Report that was sort of the decider, but that was the one that you was just like, wait a minute, we got to cover that up too. Because they're manipulating the system, of course. So, and remember, they're in a dream state. It's just this kind of interesting dream state. If you're going to say that is an interesting movie, because that in part helps describe what a precognitive psychic can do.
Mm-hmm.
And I put "do" in quotes because it's not so much doing as this nonlinear sensing of events, sometimes a bit obscured in this dream state. And I think Minority Report captured it very well based on how people describe their own dreams. Dreams themselves is a fascinating area, something I'm extremely familiar with, but I don't talk about it much because it's so nonlinear. But some of the most interesting experience I've had have always been in the dream state. And it's as real can be, depending on the kind of dream. And we're not talking like the ones where, the classic dreams where you're flying like you're flying, like a bird, but you don't have wings, but you're flying like the normal rules, right? The rules in terms of Newtonian, Newtonian doesn't seem Newtonian rules, right? Yep. Doesn't work, right? It's much more quantum, but I'll even say it's even beyond that. But quantum, sort of the quantum mechanics, right? You're talking mechanics, Newtonian, but then there's sort of like, there's this whole other, there are, planets spin, right? Orbits, all that. How do you explain this one, right? Because it seems to defy what you would call normative rules. It's important that those rules exist, right? I could walk out into the street as a truck's, coming down the road, and if I don't move aside, and assuming he doesn't brake, right? Guess what? Yeah, reality's going to hit pretty hard. Okay. I can't. Oh no, I'll just let it pass
literally
through me,
and
right?
figuratively. Right.
Oh, I'll just let it pass through me, right? Well, I could argue at a quantum level, everything is space, right? So, but there's everything vibrates, at different frequencies, right? And which is fascinating itself. Remember, I've literally, as a kid, it's a thing called sublimation, where you actually literally watch snow go straight to vapor, right? There's no in between liquid. It just goes straight from solid to vapor. Interesting, right? Can you see vapor? No, but you can certainly feel the effects of it. So I got to meet, and that's a story in itself, but Chris Robinson, had come on, let's just say, had emerged on the horizon. And I got to meet him shortly after 9/11. And I have to acknowledge that I did as much homework as I could ahead of time, but I also knew, because of my rather senior status at the agency, I couldn't put both sides of this. I couldn't tell anybody other than the couple of people I was working with on this particular, and even they were super close hold and sharing just about anything with anybody else. Remember, the advantage they had is they weren't part of the production chain at NSA, so they could just go off and basically freeform. Right? That's kind of the discovery. It was this discovery model, right? To uncover things that didn't even know that you didn't know them, right? Which sort of riff on the famous Rumsfeld quote. There's things you know, things you don't know, and the things we don't know you don't know.
Yeah, known unknowns.
The known unknowns and the unkunks. I always call them the unkunks. Yeah. The unkunks. The unknown unknowns. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So got to meet him, and just sort of other than, of course, I had my commonality with him in terms of culture was I had lived in England a couple of times, and a very unassuming person, and yet it turns out, and he had this, I'll just call it a gift, insight, but extremely nonlinear. And normally it would take place, as he described it, just describing it, usually in this kind of in-between dream state. Some call it automatic writing. That would basically do it a disservice to say it's just automatic writing. But he's actually writing things down, and I'll just call it the intentionality space. There are those kind of in the more mystical realm that will call it something different, but I abhor labels. I have to be very careful and simply using a word because that can become very limiting, right? I'm referring to it as the intentionality space, even though that's awkward in itself, but you're in this space where intentions / motivations, right, for the purpose, what is it you're planning or what is it you're doing, is in part accessible. I'm not going to speculate on source, because that can really easily go down a rabbit hole or two or three. You can go
UFOs, you can go demons and angels. Yeah. Understood. Yeah.
I'm aware of archetypes. I'm aware of all sort of the legends and myths and the stories, right? At least either passed down orally or in written form, right? Some of them are actually, in the open, others aren't, right? I'm very familiar with all of that. It's part of wow, this is interesting. And there seems to be these patterns, commonalities.
As part of this process, did you ever investigate Chris Bledsoe, since he's known to the intelligence community in some way?
I'm aware of the name, but never.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, I didn't mean to derail you. I just wanted to ask you that.
But you can imagine at an institution like NSA, this stuff is
way
out of it. It's so far, as we would say, off the range that to even consider that it would be valid at any level is just sort of ludicrous, right? You're in sort of
lose your security clearance.
Yes, and you're in sort of, and I'll say it with a hyphen, nonsense space. Nonsense space. But this is the validation. I was speaking of validation because he has an interesting track record, initially involving, and I'm certainly familiar from when I lived in England, and this was the time there were certain off limits, right, because of the IRA, right? The Irish Republican Army. It wasn't so much us, but if you found yourself in a no-go zone, you could get caught up, even though Americans were historically not targeted. You could find yourself, right, because they were actually planting bombs, assassinating people, blowing things up, right? You're going back, the 70s and 80s. So, and the whole thing with Northern Ireland, and then just some interesting UK history, right? So he had a track record, particularly with local police departments, in being able to both predict, but also being brought into the scene of a crime, or basically, especially when it involved loss of life, injury, and being able to sense, and I have to say that, right? Sense what had, not just what had happened, but what else could you glean from what he sensed being in that space. And this is sort of, there's like the post-crime, but there's also, if you're trying to track down perpetrators, right, the culprit, etc., especially when it was involving, we're talking at the assault homicidal level, right? So this is basically human on human violence, negative energy. He's picking up on that. And there's again, this is very, challenging to say in words, picks up on that energy, even if it's faint, that's left behind based on whatever those violent acts or assaults took place. And they began to rely on him, not solely, of course, but at providing as a source, but providing information that would lead to arrests, monitoring, etc. And he would be placed, you imagine, undercover and on special teams to help support those types of investigations. But he also would have these dream state events quite frequently, not all the time, but quite frequently. And a lot of them were in codes, both symbolic as well as words or combinations, right?
Like dogs for terrorists, snow for like certain types of events.
Yeah. And the one that's of relevance here is he actually went to the authorities at the time, okay, because he had dreams about the Twin Towers and the associated dogs, to say it that way. And of course, you can imagine, right? Even with his record that is documented, how that was received.
Yeah, I mean, even if you believed him, what is somebody at a highly technical organization at the NSA supposed to do? Say, hey,
correct,
we got word from a psychic that this is going to happen, so let's stop everything. And I mean, it would have never, even if you knew, you couldn't do it.
I'll put it this way. I know a lot more about this in terms of sort of that background, but just to say it succinctly, it never rose to a level in which it was ever considered, let alone one could ever take action upon it, meaning as a warning.
Mm-hmm.
And it's critical on the cultural side of the intelligence community. Counterterrorism simply was not a priority in this time period. That 98, 99, 2000, it was just not, right? You would think it would have been. You would have, right? Non-state actors, looking for spectacular events. And there's a whole history. I wouldn't even go into them. Khobar Towers, Cole, bombing. There's a whole bunch, right? It just, because it would have required a significant reorientation. There's no question about that, to actually prioritize those who go off using non-traditional communication means. This is sort of a hint. Non-traditional communication means between human beings at the courier level, and certain ways in which you can actually, in the open, provide codes as to what you are to do, right? Now, it's interesting because that's sort of the classic, the cellular level nature of a conspiracy with very few, and I know this from compartmented programs, you're basically protecting the integrity, right, of what it is, right? Its purpose exists. You don't want everybody because there's such a high risk. The reward is far greater, but the risk of revealing or exposure could drop the whole thing. Now, if you're on intelligence, you want to get into the cycle early on as possible. This, again, is early as possible. But how do you do that? You can't wait until linear evidence shows up in all cases, meaning the thing that your sensors are optimized to, quote unquote, pick up on. This is in the pre-execution phase. Okay. This is in the phases where people are meeting in secret, communicating in secret, okay, and planning something really, really big. If you're talking like threats to national security and harm to other people. People that actually are focused on ill will toward others at a significant level. We're not talking a mere spat. We're not talking about off the cuff stuff. We're talking about really serious. We want to make a statement, right? And obviously generate fear and a whole bunch of other things, right? And we get into history. Why does it even occur? Why separate from this propensity of, just given the history of humanity, this propensity to engage in war, conflict, and just lots of stuff that's negative. So he's accessing, again, the nonlinear space, a very nonlinear space of people's intentionality, or the intentionality, as I call the intentionality space. Now, the concern after 9/11 was there was concern that there was other operations underway. There was other cells that were operating both within and without and in between the United States and its interests. Speaking just about the United States for the context of all this. Remember, here's a foreign national, right, who claims that he actually had information that the Twin Towers were a target. Yeah. So,
and you had evidence. You had evidence to show that he had documented it before 9/11, before.
Yes. Right. Yes. Well before. He even got the authorities, just came up short, as I mentioned. But now, wait a minute. Can you predict, right, going forward, is there anything else going on, right? It's one thing to, 9/11 obviously wasn't stopped. Now, it turns out there was other hijackers, right? There was part of the larger plot, and it had been delayed, by the way, but the larger plot involved other airplanes. You actually have testimony from people. Some were very concerned about, it turns out, training runs, right? Where they were, remember, because all they had were box cutters basically and just muscle, right? And a much smaller number that, quote unquote, learned how to, didn't have to worry about taking off. Like, wait a minute. They just want to know how to do the basic, And there's whistleblowers, by the way, Colleen Rowley, FBI. There was a whole nother set of evidence, right? Never mind evidence, CIA. They're just, never mind all that. But remember, NSA is in the communication space. This is kind of critical because this is extraordinarily rich, right? In terms of just how you get messages around in all the various ways. So now it's post 9/11. There could be other plots. There could be others hiding in cells that haven't been activated, right? What do we do, right? Can we help, right? This is probably, we need all the data. We need all the data. No, that's actually not what you need. Not all the data. You just need a very small subset of the data. What I call the truly suspicious, reflection. It's not that, that's part of this weird, it's almost religious. It's almost cult-like. I haven't used it. It's interesting, cult-like and this obsession with the data. Like, it's not the data. It's not the data. Data only reflects who created it, provided it, etc. This is partly sort of how you get blinded by technology, right? You focus on And I get it. We love our toys, right? I get it. However, but it's true. Just imagine, I mean, what is on people's, especially smartphones, tablets, etc., staggering amount of information about a person's life. It's not everything, but it's increasingly a massive amount of it, right? Massive. Metadata itself, right, can say a whole lot. Well, this is this whole other aspect because, again, 9/11 is a failure. How do we prevent the next 9/11? So there really was this like, oh my God, we cannot ever have this happen again. Well, to do that, you better get better at not only discovering the patterns, the connections, the links, but you better get a lot better at the proactive prediction. Again, the indications and warning. And usually you don't want the indications to rise to a warning because a warning is usually much, much closer in time. Speaking of time, you may not have enough time. It turns out that the final go signal, right? The go signal, even in traditional collection of NSA, never mind the nonlinear stuff that showed up in the linear space, right? That was giving directions, control, and what to do well prior to 9/11, okay? That's a whole story in itself. Don't have really time to go into it, but it's fascinating because if that had been picked up on early on, you would have been inside in part the messaging system, part of the messaging systems they were using to communicate with quote unquote the plotters, right? Remember, they were basically compartmented and watched from each other, right? Except where they couldn't, as we're down at the cell level.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's like you don't want to wait to the warning. The warning is like, oh my gosh, that's sort of like the weather. I'll use weather as an example. We have, weather alerts, you have advisories. Well, once you get to a warning, that usually, remember, it is predictive that the likelihood that that's going to happen. Yeah, a foot of snow is going to show up, right? Or whatever. Hurricane's going to hit between this hour and that hour. Gee, where's all that information coming from, right?
Well, I remember like prior to 9/11, 2 weeks prior to 9/11, roughly, we went on ThreatCon Bravo, if I remember correctly. So the intelligence community knew something was coming. I just don't think they knew exactly.
They did.
There was some warning that.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway,
But the warning, that warning had been going on at least formally since 1998 via George Tenet. So there was this huge urgency post 9/11 to prevent whatever else was in the works or could be in the works or might arise. So the work of this research lab to me, and then and again, we don't have time to go into it. At one point, I was actually reaching out to other non-traditional places and other agencies, especially in the future scenario space, right? So I met with him. I remember the whole validation part, the documented record. How do we get this information, right? And this is, again, a whole nother story where there was this is Cheney created his own, I'll just call it network he basically bypassed, which within itself, it caused its own issues. He didn't trust the normal intelligence system. Remember, he was extremely experienced in national security, going all the way back. But he decided that he was going to basically bypass the traditional reporting system and rely on his own network. I knew people inside that network. I actually met, one key person, won't mention names, very high up within the intelligence community, but because anything, and I would even use like the movie, right? That why not at least consider the possibility that at least could help understand, even if it didn't predict. I understand your reluctance to consider any kind of prediction, but at least give another perspective, and it's a perceptual in part perspective. Remember, perception is reality from a nonlinear space. And I won't say non-scientific. I would actually argue that you can, in fact, but they were, see, this is where things get politicized. Hell-bent, I'm not kidding you, shortly after 9/11, hell-bent on invading Iraq. That just came this obsession, right? Even different, like, he's still in the mountains, Tora Bora, like, you would think, So, yeah, it took many more years, right? Hiding in opens, it turns out, in the open, next to a Pakistani military academy. And, yeah. So,
which says a lot about Pakistan.
Yeah.
More about Pakistan than Bin Laden, but anyway.
So, on a personal note, and you may have some other, I realize you're probably open up for, questions from you and clarification and some of the other avenues here that, just given what I've shared already, is he had a dream in which these 10 bottles, these green bottles, showed up. And it turns out, remember, we're talking many years later, but I stayed in contact with him, right? And those 10 bottles, clearly, based on everything around it, represented, before I was even indicted, the actual 10 felony count indictments. It's just too coincidental, right?
Well, didn't he share that with you, though, before the indictment came, over like a transatlantic telephone call?
Yes.
In which
a whole lot of
I'm assuming was probably monitored by the people who were going to put up the indictments.
Yeah, very possible. Yes, it's very possible. But of course, they're not going to be able to read anything into this. You can't, if you just look at what he would write, scribble, or represent on paper, very difficult to make any sense of it. Because you're getting into representations, right, from the dream state based on intentionality. Now, I can't fully explain it, and nor would it would be way too arrogant or hubristic of me to even begin to say why. I just know it's an is, and he's a vessel. I'll use that word, a vessel in which this information is shared. And it is true that by itself, it doesn't mean anything. You have to then take that and put it into sort of the larger context of the real world. The challenge, of course, is this is precognitive, meaning it is, in essence, it is representing a future that hasn't happened yet. But in the dream, it's happened, but it's representative because it hasn't manifested. Another word I'm using in a nonlinear way. It hasn't manifested into reality, which means it hasn't happened yet. Does that mean it will happen? No, not necessarily. I'm not going to, separate from getting into, destiny and free will and all that, right?
Well, even like Hugh Everett's many worlds theory of quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Right? This could just be branches, and this could just be perceived one branch, and maybe again, it's
now the
pure
closer
speculation.
Though, again, There's many examples he has, right? I'm just giving you a couple, but the closer the event, remember, this is how you're going back and then look, the closer to the event as the dreams themselves, right, are, say, forwarded. Okay, this is kind of weird. Forwarded from the future in the present become more accurate because you're getting closer and closer to sort of, and this is the event horizon in which it actually manifests. Meaning, if you're talking the 10 green bottles that he had before I was indicted, well, yeah, okay, that's like, I'll put huge quotes, air quotes around proof. the fact was I was indicted, right? And it was 10 felony counts. It was a different set before, but by the time it got to here's the formal indictment that we actually filed with the court, April 14th, well, yeah, of 2010, ends up being 10 felony count indictments. So the ability is not just like sort of at the world level, it also applies at the personal level. Of course, there's an overlap. So I became aware, and this again, in the course of my continuing relationship with him during this period, he got involved in a number of experiments. And the one that I'm most familiar with is the Arizona experiments. There was a particular professor, university, where I actually, part of my connection,
Dr. Gary Schwartz, right?
Gary Schwartz, yes. My first master's was from the University of Arizona, Tucson. So he was doing this interesting research, right? And they did a series of experiments. And this gets into, how do you provide, and I'm separate from how, there's those who will easily debunk this on a linear basis, and they'll argue all the issues, correlation is not causation, coincidence does not mean proof, all of sort of the logical analysis of this. So I became very familiar. No, I was not part of, but I became very familiar with those experiments. And for anybody who actually delves into it, reads it.
Yeah, it's a book.
Yes. It does give you pause, right? It gives you pause as to how do you know? And remember, it's something a trick you knew ahead of to know. You get into like, how do you provide, double blind, triple blind, right? In terms of ensuring that you don't contaminate the test, right? So here you're actually using, in part, scientific methodology to actually see, and then what are the results? And they were all very carefully scribed, right? Way ahead of time. This wasn't, afterwards or reinterpret, what happened. No.
Yeah, I think they had
this
to identify,
idea of finding.
He had the part of the experiment that he had to identify or remote view 10 different locations in Arizona.
Yep.
And he was accurate on 10 out of 10, something like that. And they were really, some of them were really obscure. And he had to do it. He didn't have to he had a list where he had to do all 10. It was something like he had to do it right before they went to that specific location.
That's right. Yep.
So it was, the probability of getting that right is probably, I'm just guessing, is probably 1 over 10 factorial. Something like that.
There, you could actually, the probability, you can actually calculate that, right? What are the odds, right, that he would be able to predict with extraordinary accuracy? Now, you can still argue there's room for interpretation, right? You can, but that's just one series of experiments / tests. Now, what's interesting as a side note is even he will acknowledge, to his credit, it's very difficult to explain any of this. And in fact, some time ago, I've had long conversations about how do you explain this space period, right? Sort of this nonlinear. How do you explain that? Because it sounds weird at one level, strange. It's like you're in an unexplainable space, but there's like this, we sometimes use interesting language to describe something that you can't really explain it. So it's kind of there's other language we use to describe a weird space that allows us to sort of set it aside without like being too disturbed or disrupted by it. Because if I really wanted to open up that box, right, I might not want to know, quote unquote, because I would be confronted, and sometimes for some people, this is existential, right? That my very identity is like, oh my gosh, right? Am I standing on solid ground, right? Well, there may be certain parts of my belief system, right? Whether it's cultural, whether it's ideological, whether it's religious, that might be at risk, right? So why would I risk, especially if my identity is tied to it?
Okay. During this period of exploration of kind of these nonlinear phenomena, whatever that means, Was there anything else you explored aside from precognitive dreaming and remote viewing? We talk about remote viewing all the time, so I don't want to go there. Were there any other spaces that you explored that fit somewhere in this category? Again, the category is very loose.
No.
Okay.
I'm no, not in this space in terms of intelligence. I am aware of rabbit holes of people claiming communication with other beings, quote unquote, non-human, right, quote unquote. But that's rabbit hole stuff. I can't. I mean, I go way back in terms of people, and I've yet to. It's just interesting. Even this latest sort of burst of, "Hey, I'm a whistleblower." And yet, when you really look at it, no, I heard it from somebody. I heard from somebody. It was inside of a program. I'm aware of the Lazars of the world and all of those, and Area 51 and a whole bunch of others. But
I actually have a theory about Lazar.
yeah, but see, I will tell you when it comes to those type. Remember, I'm very familiar with super advanced technology. Okay, and again, this Arthur C. Clarke, right? Any sufficiently advanced technologies Institute for Magic. There are things, right, that are kept well hidden, right? And there are certain people in the government don't want others to know about it. And so, you know, and when you talk about national security, this is where this does get weird. Weird in terms of why are things so secret, and especially why they're off the books and black projects and all this other stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I've been up in, you know, not all of them, but I've certainly been in a number of the areas, both on the ground and in the air. Without going into detail, strange happenings occur. Strange meaning it is like on that level of being that advanced, but it's not defying. I'll just say it this way: does not defy laws of physics. Okay, does not. Right. And a lot of it involves, right, anti-gravity stuff. But, you know, that's a whole nother. So, yeah, I mean, there's movies that talk about this. It's not like this is an unknown. But I realize the public is captured by sort of the aliens and space, and whether it's, you know, earthborn or far off. It's just there is something in terms of the archetypes that it is in essence representing. And this gets into sort of like, okay, life itself is pretty amazing, right? How do we even get here? My quest on a personal note is much more in that space. What is it about life, and what is it that's extraordinary about this third rock from the sun? There's enough that's written in all, I mean, I can start naming a lot of the old, I'll just say ancient texts. There's something there. There really is. And you can imagine trying to re-represent that in simply language form / whether it's cuneiform or modern languages, extremely challenging, right? But there is, all of these they kind of speak to, as I call it, sort of the epigenesis. So there does appear to be extraordinary intelligence involved. I don't get into sort of the battles, right? There's all the religious stuff. I avoid all that. I had too much of it in my younger days.
You specifically mentioned cultural anthropologists when you were talking about this organization within NSA. Does that relate to what you're talking about now, or is that something else? And if it is something else, what was it?
It's something else, but it's really looking at, again, human behavior over time. That's what it looks at.
So kind of like human factors, different shamanic traditions, stuff like that.
Yes. And there was people on this team, right, who had no problem, right? This is, again, this extraordinary freedom even would be completely at odds with the traditional approaches, right? How do you not just discover realities, right, but how do you explain them? And a lot of it is in the experience space. But see, experiential, as I became in my own academic background up to and including the PhD level.
Anecdotes are not data, right?
No, anecdotes are not data. But then what are you living? What are we living?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't often talk about this, but see, I just think there are some people, whether it's gift, whether it's they stumble and stop and like, oh, what's that? And don't keep going on, right? Are more sensitive. So there is a word that's used that in this space, and not just precogs, there are people who are more sensitive. Mm-hmm. And this is have a deeper connection to sort of the multi-layered nature of reality. And
have
this
you gone down the... Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
Well, it gets into the quantum space, right?
Mm-hmm. Have you ever gone down the paranoid schizophrenic rabbit hole in terms of...
Well, I've heard people, that's a way to explain. Yeah, and then remember, see, this is where I get really cynical, because there was all kinds of experiments that were done, including like CIA and experimenting on people. Some of them, we're talking in some cases, large numbers of people who some cases either were coerced or were they even without consent, were placed in circumstances where they simply want to see what would happen to them. And we're talking, and so, you stimulate certain parts of the brain, strange things happen. I mean, I know that from just the era in which I grew up. People would drop acid, quote unquote, and see things. Yeah, I'd rather live. Okay. Well, go ahead. But that's what I haven't shared with you, and I don't talk about this that often because, again, it's nonlinear. I can't explain what I'm about to share with you, except I had the experience. I've had several near-death experiences, and there's something about the near-death experience.
You buried the lead, Tom. You buried the lead. So many questions. Go. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm very interested in it. Okay.
I think in part that I had increased sensitivity to things that were nonlinear by virtue of experience I had when I was much younger.
So after the near-death experience, your sensitivity increased would be the...
Yes. Okay. That actually happened with Chris as well. So
when you said with Chris, is it something that your sensitivity seemed to increase after quantum entanglement with Chris, or...
No, that was just, in some ways, wow. Someone without having to, wow. It's interesting because you're getting to a conversation about this that I never have. I say never. You never say never, right? That I hardly ever have, because it's such unique, and it's so. Chris is someone who I identify with. Okay. That there is something that's far bigger and far larger behind all this, right? Behind and through and within, that does exist, right? Obviously, existence itself has multiple vibrational planes, and how things show up. You have to remember, even through our eyes, we own basically white light, right? Some people have a little bit larger. Some people can see auras, right? Brilliant, photography, quote unquote. Some people can see a lot. But the white light, as part of the electromagnetic experiment, is extraordinarily narrow. It's
right. It's like 1% or less than 1%.
Oh, it's unbelievably right. But that's where we spend most of our time. Right? It's why it's interesting. Where I've gotten to know people that were blind, what their sensitivity is extraordinarily increased in terms of just touch. Braille, right? But also especially if they still have hearing, just what they can hear that we can't. But part is not that we can't hear it. We just, again, remember that signal to noise? It's treated as basically we just don't even, yes. Yes. So the near-death experiences put me into a place that I acknowledge there's something way beyond just sort of these, bags.
Can you relate? Do you feel comfortable relating that experience? By the way, there are reams of data on this particular topic.
No, I also have multiple. Yes.
Yeah. So it's not like you're not like saying anything that.
Oh no!
My audience would think
I'm well aware of that. Right. I in my short time here on planet Earth, going to and fro, I've met any number of people something extraordinary on an everyday level. You'll never hear about them. They're not in the press. They're on the front pages. I mean, what you see on the front pages is so extraordinarily limiting because it's usually bad news, negative energy. You rarely, I mean, yeah, there's human interest, which in itself is of interest, but we're talking about something far deeper and just far, right? I myself, I realized in meeting Chris that the dreams that I had going over any number of years, right, actually meant something. They weren't just your generic dreams. And I, in the early days, would largely dismiss them. I wouldn't really consider them. I couldn't do that later. I couldn't.
So tell me about in the
quantum space. Yeah. You can go in the quantum space. There's really this idea that there's a limit, right? There isn't. It's a different set of limits, right?
Well, there's no limits to fractals, right? Like they go on.
Well, the fractals, Mandelbrot sets, Mandelbrot sets, Julian sets, extraordinarily, yes. Oh yeah, there's an infinity to this, right? There really is an infinity to this. And then you get like this whole thing is unfolding. What does it mean? It's like, is it creation sharing itself with itself? That's kind of the way I put it. That begs all kinds of questions in its own right. But it's kind of this magical carpet ride. And at least in a temporary state, here I am manifesting as flesh and blood. But then there's something else about us, right? And it's still, we don't see it fully. But the near-death experiences, no doubt, made me more sensitive. I didn't realize at the time, but I can replay the experience almost, moment by moment. But I got really sick when I was much younger. I was talking like 4 years of age. I was so sick that my temperature, fever, 106 and climbing, 106. There is a point at which you burn out, right? The body just collapses. All I remember is I was in a coma state. I was rushed to the hospital. I was literally, the doctors didn't know what to do. And what they did is they packed me in a bucket of ice, literally. And I remember at some point while I was in the bucket of ice that I was looking down at myself. And the only thing, and what was connected was a silver cord. Mm-hmm. There was my body laying. And there I am and I'll call it a non-physical state, okay? Looking down at myself. And that the cord was getting thinner and thinner. And then I also remember looking up and there was just basically this tunnel. This is this tunnel of light. It wasn't dark at all. It was this tunnel of light. And my strongest sense was it wasn't time yet. It's weird to say it. That's not time. It wasn't time yet. Speaking of time. And the next thing, I'm back in the body, right? My body. Fever broke. And although I was greatly weakened physically and had all kinds of problems for a number of years, I was the classic weakling, right? Growing up. But then I had another experience. I was 21. And I was selling vacuum cleaners. This was right before I started selling vacuum cleaners door to door for a while. And I'd been working in an apple orchard and got abscess tonsillitis to the point where I couldn't even swallow water. It was actually closing off my throat. I was rushed to the emergency room. They put me on the highest level cortisone drip that they had available, through an IV. I went into a coma for 5 days. I didn't know this until later. Because people obviously die in the hospital, they had a rotating set of like the priest, pastor, right, minister on standby. They rotate. And he came in. It was a Catholic priest, right? Final rites. And he actually, that was it. Final rites by a priest. In the Catholic tradition, because he was the religious, he was on call. And what's interesting about that one is the entire experience. All I remember is everything was completely black. There was nothing you could see. sense, feel. It was like the total non-existence of everything. It was like you were in a permanent sleep state, just all black. There was no color. It wasn't even a distinction, right? There was no, I mean, that's one interesting thing about light is that light actually, you say the absence, right? So how would you know the difference, right? So, yeah.
How did you feel when you were in that void state?
It was a void. Void is probably interesting. Void might be a better word, actually. Yeah, it was a voided state. Yeah, like there's nothing. And then I come back to life and there's everything. Which is like, what's that, right? So is that like, does what we see, I mean, the expanded see, right? The whatever, the universe, multiverse, but the universe that we know came into existence, right? At some point, right? Because it is a manifestation. And separate from asking the origin question of that, right? Which in itself is in itself is a fundamental question, but there's something also about just life itself, right? The existence of life, right? What's the opposite? No life? See, everything's dead, right? Well, wait a minute, dead. So something from nothing, sort of. That's like everything from nothing. I mean, gets deeply cosmically philosophical here, right? Right. Again, very limiting in terms of one's ability to understand, let alone describe, let alone ascribe, let alone circumscribe or explain.
Have you ever read the book Stalking the Wild Pendulum by Itzhak Bentov?
No.
I highly recommend it. It might put some of this stuff into context about the Planck length and how instantaneously we're cohering, then decohering. It's been a while since I've read it, so I'm not doing it justice here. But
Stalking the Wild Planck?
Pendulum.
Oh, the pendulum. So I said the plank and walking the plank.
Well, I did say plank. I did say something about the Planck length.
You did
after that.
Plank, but PLAN, right? The other plank. Sorry.
Yeah, Planck. I should have said it auf
actually,
Deutsch.
yeah.
Planck.
Yeah, Planck. It's Planck. Yeah. So, walking the wild pendulum. Okay. Well, pendulum. Yeah,
Stalking,
pendulum is. Yeah, stalking it. Yeah.
Well, again, hence the cohere, decohere, right?
Yeah.
And how pendulums, you put a pendulum next to another pendulum, they get into sync, right?
Well, there's cycles.
Right.
There's patterns, cycles, circles, various types.
It's all frequency and resonance, right? Right.
Well, I could argue that for even my own background, that ultimately I could describe everybody described as wave theory, if you're talking wave theory, but ultimately, which is in itself vibrational, is it a wave? Is it a wave, but then we're now discovering that there's far more even inside the atomic structure beyond just proton was like I learned in chemistry class, beyond just photons and protons and electrons and neutrons. There's a whole universe at that level, which, okay.
Yeah, and you go to the quantum scale. I'm sure if they get sophisticated to go down to that level, there's just going to be another level, right?
That's a whole nother. Exactly.
Right.
It goes, it's way deep, right? It goes way deep, or it's just way expanded. No matter which way you look at it, macro, micro, or just take it all as a whole, right? But there is this extraordinary dynamic. I mean, the pattern, and you can argue even us, animal kingdom, this sort of symmetry / asymmetry. There is this interesting sort of mirror principle in all the variety, right? And then you got something like a platypus, and it's like, how did a platypus come about, right? Just it's kind of an interesting mix, isn't it? Mammals, rather rare form of a mammal that lays eggs. Wait a minute. Right. Lays eggs. Wait, we're back to that. Lays eggs, right? Yeah, I'd stand. This is, go ahead. But for me, I'm increasing, I'll just say it this way, increasingly living in a nonlinear world. Okay. I do, even when I'm in the linear world. Now, that sometimes causes issues because, if you get in a car and drive, you got to be paying attention. Right? You can't just like, okay, yeah, separate from,
Well,
cruise
but
control system.
do you remember the last time you drove between when you arrived at your destination and when you left? Right? Your subconscious takes over, right? It's
Yes,
driving
it
for you.
does. Yes. I just stand in awe and wonder of all this. I do. There's beyond all the vagaries of conflict and war and just all the negative energy. I'm increasingly focused because, there are forces that are far greater than anything that we can even possibly conceive of in the negative space. There just seems this extraordinary obsession. I'll even say seductive attraction to negative forces, negative energies.
Right.
But that's where it's kind of being in the world, but not of the world at the same time, right? There's something extraordinary going on here. I think it's some form of amazingly cosmic grand experiment that gets into a whole nother conversation as to what's actually happening. But, you see through that glass darkly or several glasses darkly. I think there's a far grander purpose. I mean, again, this gets into other nonlinear space where people have attempted to explain it. But I'm also aware of the dark side. I have to say it that way, to use a Star Wars phrase, right? The dark side, because there are people that I grew up with, people that I met who were all into the manipulation. They were into control. They were into literally feeding off you. I have to say it that way, off your psychic energy, because that's the only way they could feed themselves. And it's not a pleasant experience at all. I know
like literal humans that are this way, but I'm guessing they're not aware of it, or are they aware of it?
No, some of them aren't, because they're seduced by the dark side to say it's okay. They really are. It because it gives them power and control.
Yeah, right? Look, I don't like to be around people for that very reason. Like, I find it exhausting, and not because And then there's particularly, types of bosses that I've had in the past that it's just exhausting to interact with them. You feel drained completely afterward. And again, I don't think much of it is intentional, but there's just some people that just suck the life out of you.
That's why a lot of dystopian novels, and one that is extremely relevant for me in the context of everything I've experienced just in the last 25 years, or so, even though it goes back further than that, 1984, and the Aldous Huxley novel, right?
Brave New
World. Yeah, it's just, never mind a multitude of dystopian movies, right? You could argue there's some huge ongoing, what's the nature of conflict, the nature of good and evil, why all of this? For me, increasingly the negative energy is just incredibly, it's very much a destructive force as well. And see, this gets into sort of my background. I spent a lot of time on RC-135s listening in on a surveillance state, East Germany.
Oh, man.
And
so speaking Stasi and all those guys.
Stasi, right? And all the military and various, again, communication systems. And it still haunts me to this day. And I had to learn quite a bit of German, highly specialized, including Russian, for my background and training for the particular jobs that I did in the 80s while in the Air Force. But the Stasi were a particularly virulent form of this negative energy in terms of having control over other human beings. And there's a word in German, Zersetzung.
Zersetzung?
Zersetzung. So Z.
It's like very, I don't know what Setzung means.
It's a chemical term. It's German's very precise. It's far less ambiguous. Difficult language to learn, interestingly enough, even though it's, European language.
Russian's harder, though. Russian's a lot harder.
Well, it depends on who you are. Some would argue. I mean, I knew all kinds of linguists, right? Multiple languages across the board. I had some would say Chinese was difficult because if you're tone deaf or, don't pick up on tones, you're going to have great difficulty learning like Mandarin. I knew my roommate was an Arab linguist, right? He actually found it easier because it was so different, right? It was so different. Right?
Mm-hmm.
In Cyrillic, it's interesting. Just I learned oral, right? It was all oral comprehension. I never learned the written language. Okay. But I can certainly understand quite a bit of Russian, especially when it's more structured. I'm not talking everyday conversation, right? I'm talking highly structured. So listening in this, the Stasi are part of that. And there's a German word for it. It's a chemical. It's a word applies in the chemical space, and it means decomposition. They actually used that because they realized, they were torturing. We're talking real torture, right? And people were just like, increasingly, they were being less and less cooperative. Yeah, there comes a point where you keep pounding up on somebody. You might extract a confession, but as I well know from my own training in this space, in the military, coerced question is not correct. Yeah. So what they did is it was the psychological, which is something, the classified training that I had to deal with that. Get inside your head, conduct massive surveillance, even when you don't know it, or if you do, you don't know exactly in what manner and how often and who and what they're doing with it. Zerzutzum is the word they used for the means and manner in which they would break them down as a human being. Basically, anomie, as a famous sociologist, a French, Émile Durkheim, said, anomie. Isolation, separation, and to the point where people begin questioning their own existence. And then you've got them, right? Much more easier to manipulate, much more easier to control. I'm very aware of that, right? Because I ended up having to live in part what that was like through all the interrogations and all the meetings and face-to-face and all the pressure and just the persecution and prosecution of me over many years. I would not want anybody to live what I lived, but having lived it, I know exactly, at least my experience, how far and willing those with negative energy are willing to go to destroy you, especially if you challenge, speak truth to power, call out the fraud, right? Call out the grift, call out those who desire having control over others. And see, having control over others is extraordinarily seductive. It's just enormous power.
For some people.
No, for some people.
Yeah, not for like.
But see, what's the kicker?
I don't understand it. I rather be left
But in this
alone.
world,
right.
That's what motivates them. That's why they are the ones attracted to positions of power, because they can have it over others, right? And they don't like it when you get in the way, right? And of course, I operate at very senior levels, and so as one of my best friends in high school said, yeah, he was unbelievably shocked that I basically got, the bear scratched me, carved out some, big chunks, but I didn't end up in prison because he thought I was going to end up behind bars for years. He was a public defender in the state of Vermont, right? He was one of the investigators, right? He knew because of things that we did when we were in high school that I never even told my parents, dealing with negative energy, right? But when you're talking about state power and the power of the state is enormous, they have the power to put you away for a long time. So that's not a world I want to live in. I'm focused on a world, and this gets into future casting, right? Future scanning, future prediction. I would rather live in a world, although I'll have people who prefer the negative, who say, oh, that's boring. Why would you want to live in a world where well-being and one's health and the welfare of others matters? I say, well, we're capable of far more in a collaborative. This is the environment I actually later in my professional career worked in. How do you create high-performing teams? My original PhD dissertation original. It changed, right? And writing about what happened to me. It was an ethnographic study, which in itself was controversial, even at the university I was at, because like it's qualitative, hard to put in numbers. Yeah, you're interviewing people, but then you got to account for confirmation bias and blah, 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 all of that. But the original dissertation was focused, you might remember Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Famous. But he realized late in life, and it was published posthumously, that you could have a healthy individual, but if they were inside of an unhealthy organization, guess what happened to the individual? He actually was like, it was almost his own mea culpa. He realized you can't have healthy individuals in organizations that are toxic or unhealthy.
Right.
So it ended up being edited and published, right? And I was going to originally, based on all my negative experiences in organizations across the board, small, large, and especially large, the Booz Allen Hamiltons of the world had very negative experiences there, got up to the management level and just like, wow, this is just not for me.
I did an internship there, actually.
Wow. It's just, you have to compromise yourself.
It was fine. Right? It was like 3 months.
Yeah. There was a lot of things that were fine. I mean, okay, right? I mean, say okay. I was usually working on government contracts, but it's just the negative energy. There's this. I mean, that's where the Star Wars. I mean, this is, you sort of talk about sort of the Joseph Campbell approach, right? Although
just for reference, Booz Allen Hamilton was pleasant compared to investment banking.
Well, but I had people. I mean, early on, Tom, why didn't you go out? You're smart. You have all the background. Why don't you just, maximize your income potential? I said, that's not what life's all about. Yeah, you need enough, but sheesh, I don't need millions or billions, right? And I'm going to end up, at least in this form, expiring, Remember, J. Paul Getty, there's this famous, this is early on, I learned this, right? J. Paul Getty, he was purportedly the world's first billionaire.
Mm-hmm.
End of his life, there was this interview in Life magazine when Life magazine was still around. I remember reading it, and it's like, here he is surrounded by extraordinary opulence and wealth out in California. And he's saying, he was like, he wasn't happy because he had no one to share it with, which, says a whole lot about his personal life.
Right.
About him. All that acquisition for what? Geez. Is that really what life's about? It's just acquisition? I guess in the absence of real purpose, of real meaning, then all you do is, how can I extract? I mean, just have many, many examples in human history. And so I'm increasingly focused in that space. How do you, the antidote to negative energy, which I am willing to share with you, won't be surprising what I say, okay? Because it's unconditional and it's infinite.
Yeah.
But people hear this and they go, oh yeah, that's just words. But that's love. But I'm talking about, there's all kinds of love, but I'm talking truly unconditional love. But see, that's the thing negative energy absolutely abhors, right? Because you're free, right? You're free. So why is autonomy so important? Why is moral agency so critical? Why is your own, identity in terms of who you are as a sacred human being? And I focus on the being part. People talk about human species, but they forget that we're human beings. Beings is a state. Beings is not, it's a state. What does it mean to be? Okay. So that's where I'm increasingly focused as I enter the early stages of my golden years. And I have more time now, right? I have more time because I've sort of taken myself out of not only am I an escapee from the deep state, I've left the corporate world, right? And I'm retired. It does afford, I have all kinds of interests, but it does afford me much more time to do all these things, because the real life is the hidden life. That life is the life you don't see, right? That's the life that's worth living. And that's where I'm increasingly focused. I can get easily as much fascinated and hooked by all, see, part of the problem is there's all this negative energy generates drama. And you psychologically, and they've shown there's the dopamine, you get hooked on that because it is a pleasure to have drama. And if you don't have enough of it, if you're addicted to it, then you'll create it for yourself. And right, in some cases, the main way to do that is get others involved.
Yeah,
but it's not fair to them, right? In the end, what do you turn into? I remember Gollum in the what's the trilogy, right? The Peter Jackson trilogy, The Return of the King.
No, Gollum, yeah.
Gollum, right? What was his absolutely obsessed to the point he was reduced to this really, really twisted creature, right? The ring, right? Yeah.
On that note, I think it's a great way to end the episode.
Yeah.
The ring.
The fire. It's
well, that has multiple.
Yes, it does.
Time is a ring, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been quite an experience with you. I don't often go down certain paths, as you might imagine, right? With any frequency.
We're going to have you come back at some point.
Okay.
Because there's so many places that we can go with this. So thank you very much, my friend.
You're welcome. No, thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.